Welcome. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program, and thank you for joining us today. I'm your host, Daniel Davis, and we've got a wonderful guest for us today. We're going to be talking about some very unique things, especially when it comes to manhood and maturing. I remember some years ago that I did a very interesting show regarding an individual who was actually initiated into a Mayan village. And he was talking about things such as how the culture itself thrived and survived and passed down tradition. He says everything was basically initiation and rites of passage. And I thought to myself, there seems to be a real deep touch of not only romanticism as far as that kind of goes, but also at the same time a feeling of belonging. And I thought that, in America and probably in other places around our civilized world, that a lot of that seems to be going away. We're going to be talking about that today with our guest who's joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program, Al Polito. Excuse me. He is a spiritual director and ordained minister, writer, and performing songwriter based in Portland. He's going to be talking with us today about that very subject. And Al, thank you for joining us on the program today.
Thanks a lot, Daniel. It's good to be here.
Now, I came across your article, The Male Roadmap. Tell us about that.
The Male Roadmap. Well, Male Roadmap is essentially a way of being able to plot your life within a context of being male. So a lot of times, a guy looks at his life and says, well, when exactly do I become a man? Because there is, as you pointed out, the typical rites of passage are absent from Western culture, from modernity in general. So the Male Roadmap is what we do is we take a familiar cultural image of like the medieval journey from, like being a knight or being a king or whatever, and plotting one's life sort of along a symbolic trajectory that parallels that. So, you as a boy, you would be the thing that you are before a knight, which is in that lore a page. A page is the guy who polishes the swords, tends to the horses, and you become a knight. Then you become a prince, and then after that you become a king. And then even beyond king, there's another designation which you might call elder.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I know. It was funny because as I was reading the article myself, I realized, that's funny because I asked myself the same question. As a child, you take a look at the friends of your parents and you realize these are adults. When do I belong in this particular group? You become a teenager and you seem to subtly be accepted into the group, but you know yourself, this particular awareness, well, I'm still a boy or a girl. And then all of a sudden you realize that you're starting to talk and relate with these adults that before you felt were looking at you as this child, and all of a sudden you feel like you're an adult, but you wonder, where was the threshold? Where was the passage that you actually crossed over where you in fact became an adult, a man or a woman for that case? And so, as you were saying in your article, one of the things that has been lost are those rites of passage. Let's talk about why those things are so important and how come, because they're lost today, that it might make people feel a loss of identity or belonging.
Sure. So, as you pointed out earlier when you were introducing the show, this is something that has been part of traditional societies pretty much since the dawn of humanity. We can, if you go into the earliest architectural sites, anthropologists will say, we think this particular cave was used for rituals such as initiation. They'll look at the art that's on the wall, etc. And, as you pointed out, even in Mayan culture today, if you go down to Guatemala or someplace like that, there's still, vestiges of those kinds of rites of passage. And you'll also notice that if you even look at some of today's religions, Catholicism, Judaism, are two that I know about, there are still vestiges within them. Jews celebrate bar mitzvah, which is kind of a passage to spiritual adulthood. Catholics have, confirmation, where you're supposed to, be a confirmed kind of adult in the church, where you have sort of your calling or something. But yeah, those passages have gone away, and I think that a big part of why those passages have gone away is because society has lost space for them. Now, if you look at the threshold that Western culture crossed, it would probably be sometime sort of between the agrarian revolution and the industrial revolution. But especially, I mean, the death knell was the industrial revolution, where the average guy, ceased to, his standing in the community ceased to matter. He became a resource to be used by a company, and in order to survive economically, he'd have to go off to a city somewhere and be all of a sudden separated from his community of birth, from his culture. And so, really, I think with that estrangement came the loss of all those important rituals. But it wasn't something that happened immediately. It was something that happened over time.
Right.
I would also say that that as we probably moved from a pre-Christian society to a Christian society too, and the church became the primary institution, I think a lot of those rituals, which are kind of held in some of the pagan spiritualities, were also kind of, I think that was another blow to the classic initiation ritual.
Yeah, now let's talk about, does it still happen in places around the world where rites of initiation or passage are still practiced, and what do they look like as far as those particular ceremonies may be?
There's a really good movie that I really, really love that came out, I guess, in the 80s, maybe early 90s, called The Emerald Forest. It was a John Boorman film. Do you recall that film?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, well, to kind of bring the readers up to speed if they haven't seen that movie, it's a story of a young Anglo kid whose family is down in Brazil. His dad's a civil engineer working on a dam project, and one day when the family's out looking at the site, the little boy disappears into the woods and is adopted, basically kind of kidnapped by an indigenous, uncontacted tribe that lives on the periphery of where this dam project is. And so the boy grows up, gets adopted by the chief of the tribe, while his father spends the next 12 or so years trying to find his boy. So around the time when the plot really starts to thicken, the young boy is taken to, basically he's abducted from his mother. Essentially, he's out there playing in the water, and the village men show up, and they rip him from his mother's arms, and they say, "Okay, it's Tome's time to become a man. Tome must die."
Okay.
Yeah, and so there's a death that happens, and so what they end up doing is they take him out into the forest. I think they cover him with honey or something like that, and he gets attacked by ants, and that's his ritual death. And if you look at initiation rituals throughout indigenous cultures, there's always a death of sorts. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's a physical. Usually, it involves some sort of physical pain or darkening that symbolizes death. And it also, and they're also kind of ripped away from the mother. So there's a separation. Okay, you are no longer your mother's. You are now, you belong to the company of men. So, yeah.
Yeah, I know in many cases, too, even if you look at island tribes, it's about going off and becoming the man to go fishing with the men or to become part of the hunting group, especially in the Native American tribes. And again, as I was alluding to earlier in the program, I had an opportunity to talk with a gentleman who slowly was initiated into a Mayan village to not only become their ceremonial musician, playing the flute for a ceremony, but also as the shaman as well. And what was interesting is that he wrote a book. It was called Long Life, Honey in the Heart, My Initiations by the Edge of a Mayan Lake. And as I began to read, or as I was reading this book, especially as they talk about this one particular boy who I wished I could remember the rite of passage or the initiation that he had, but there was this feeling of grandeur and pride as he came wafting out in this particular ceremonial outfit that only he could wear because of the initiation itself, and how the village surrounded him and the respect that he was paid as he stepped, becoming this 17-year-old into a man. I think it was even younger than that, but it was right around that age. And I thought to myself, and here you get the opportunity to maybe leave the house away from your mom and dad to go to a McDonald's and have a cheeseburger with friends, and that to me didn't seem very romantic.
Right.
And it made me really start thinking about what types of rites of passage, without initiation that is, without ceremony, that we actually have. Now let's talk about those, and because you could begin to see where a person like you or a person like myself would ask that question, when did I become a man?
Well, looking back in my own life, I remember a threshold, and it was interesting because it occurred between my father and myself, and it was something that was never spoken of formally. But when I was, my dad was pretty well off, and he took really good care of our family, and so we were all really well provided for. But there was a certain thread, as long as you're, and even paid for our college educations and everything. And as soon as I started working for myself, paying my own rent, I remember my father taking a different tone with me. And that was the primary relationship that shifted, where I felt like a man. It's like my dad is now treating me, speaking to me like a man. He's expecting me to make my own mistakes now. He's not there to catch me when I fall, like he was before.
Mm-hmm.
And there was no right associated with it, but it did take place in the context of my primary community, which was my family.
Right.
And I think that since there are no real formal rights, I think that it's we can create them for the communities that we're in, and I'm still kind of looking for places where that happens. But ultimately, I think it's up for us to look and see where we cross the threshold ourselves, and when do I become a man to myself? When do I have that self-respect that shows me that I am no longer a kid in my family, but someone who has responsibilities and duties in his own right? And am I willing to honor myself for that? Am I willing to say, okay, am I willing to define manhood on my own terms? Yeah, because ultimately, whether you're part of a traditional society in Guatemala or if you live in New York City, ultimately the authority that a man answers to is himself. His own code of what makes a man. And it's interesting to sit in a circle of men and to talk about what defines a man. And all of a sudden, guys who have never spoken about it before, really, all of a sudden start sounding a hell of a lot like men who know that they're men.
Yeah. I know that, for instance, as I was reading your article, there was an interesting thing that you were talking about here about a woman who was doing some really interesting work that you seem to have a lot of respect for. It was a program, I suppose, developed by an Alison Armstrong. And something just in that simple little paragraph made me resonate with the fact that as you take a look at today's youth, as they get older, it almost seems like there's no real transformation at times. As far as what I mean by that is a mature respect toward each other, how women relate and respect with men and how men relate and respect women. And you can see how when you don't have certain rites of passage or celebrations that initiate you into these different levels, how that respect can kind of go away. Do you see that same kind of a situation going on there?
Well, I would say so. I think that there's sort of a part of the math of being a human being. I think is that you can only give what you have. And if you have understanding, respect, and knowledge of yourself, respect for yourself, knowledge of who you are and what you're about, or at least a pretty good idea, you can at least give that same acknowledgement to others.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, again, that's kind of a big part of adulthood is developing that.
Mm-hmm. Now, tell us about the program that she initiates or helps people with and how that works.
Sure. Well, Allison is, from my understanding, it's been a while since I've actually talked to her, but she has been developing some programs ongoingly, but her main program for women is called Celebrating Men and Satisfying Women. Celebrating Men, Satisfying Women. And
seems like a good title for a program.
Oh yeah, I'm down with that. I love to be celebrated and to satisfy myself.
Exactly.
And
a lot of great benefits with something like that. Sure.
Yeah. And what I love about Allison and her programs is that she's really done with the whole battle of the sexes thing.
Uh-huh.
Hey, we're all grown-ups. We're all imperfect people, but we're all pretty cool. So men and women are designed differently. We speak a different language. Our brains work a bit differently. How do we account for that? How do we use that in our communication? And that's a big part of what Allison teaches. So it's really important. She helps women to see that the guy that they dated, the guy that they're dating right now, who's maybe 27, why are you expecting him to make a big commitment to you? And they're all disappointed, that this 27-year-old guy won't commit. Well, it's like not his time of life to commit.
Right.
And if you can just understand that math, then maybe you can, if you really want a guy who'll commit, find a guy who's in his 30s, who's looking to build a family,
Exactly.
So stay away from the 27-year-old guy. There's nothing wrong with being 27 and and wanting to go on adventures. That's what you do when you're 27.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. We have a caller here joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program. Allison, you're on the Beyond 50 radio program. Could you please tell us, do you have a question or comment for our guest today?
Hi. Hello.
Hi.
Hi. Yes, I am. I'm interested in male and female energies as they evolve over the years, and there's an understanding that children have male and female energies in balance, and then when they become teenagers, they go to an extreme where they're hyper-masculine, hyper-feminine, and then when they become an adult, they come back into balance. In your studies, do you see a relationship with what I just mentioned to explain maybe that's a kind of a movement towards adulthood? Is when you're back in balance again?
That's a good observation, but I think that there are some exceptions, and I'll tell you why. I think that there's a genetic disposition that everybody has toward a particular, balance of masculine and feminine energy. There are kids, little boys who naturally, like a brother and like two brothers. One boy will be all about the trucks and the toy soldiers, and the other kid will be kind of more about the animals and maybe more dramatic kind of games. And I think that the first boy has a little more masculine polarity, the second boy a little more feminine in his blood. And what you said is true, that towards adulthood and especially towards seniority, what happens is the masculine integrates towards the feminine, and the feminine integrates towards the masculine. So, yes, there are some kids who are hyper masculine or hyper feminine. Some of it's nature, some of it's nurture. I tend to think that it's mostly that innate balance or that innate default setting. I think that it's really genetic and varies from kid to kid. But what you'll notice as people grow older, the more when I'm careful to say feminine integrates towards masculine and vice versa, rather than rather than saying a male integrates towards his feminine side, because there are women who have a lot of masculine energy and a lot of men who have a very feminine energy. And what happens is whatever side they're on, and it's usually males being masculine, females being feminine, they begin to integrate pardon me. They can integrate the characteristics of their polar. So you'll notice that the most spiritually evolved men, regardless of their natural polarity, will have a softness, a thoughtfulness and nurturing characteristic. And you'll find that women who are spiritually mature are fierce, and they are not to be messed with. Even though they may be dainty and feminine, you don't want to cross them.
That's an interesting observation, because I've seen exactly what you're talking about there.
Excellent.
Now,
so does that answer your question, Allison?
Yeah, I believe it did there. It looks like she got cut off. That was actually a really interesting question, talking about energy fields and, feminine and masculine, because sometimes you kind of wonder in this world, especially here in the United States with our pop culture, that seems to be defining what that really looks like, and what you basically see, at least, is a lot of cloning and copycatting rather than real authenticity. Is that a kind of an observation that maybe perhaps you've made yourself?
I would say so, yeah. There are definite... Well, one thing I would say is that pop culture, by the decade, gives us different models of what's masculine and what's feminine.
Right.
And it's interesting to observe that. For instance, back when I was a teenager, or maybe even a preteen, if I can use a little bit of a racy example, Burt Reynolds, I think, was like in Playgirl magazine or something like that, and there was a big hoopla about it, and there he was with his hairy chest and his mustache, and that was like the masculine look, okay, hairy, masculine, and now then go into the 90s, and you have, especially the late 90s, you have these hunky guys with shaved or waxed chests, no facial hair, and now we're coming into the 2000, into the next century, and hair's coming back, but not the buff thing. And it's interesting, there's a lot of fashion that actually dictates it, and
right.
Not real substance. Because pop culture is all about commodifying.
Sure.
And you find that, and the sad thing is that teenagers are the ones who get caught up in it. Because heck, their parents aren't the ones who are teaching them what it means to be a man or a woman. They're getting it from MySpace, Facebook, and Grand Theft Auto and other video games.
I was just thinking, as you were using the Burt Reynolds analogy, I thought maybe you might allude to something else, but you can even take a look at what has become one of the ultimate babysitters this day and age is the television. And then, for instance, if we go back in time, when you looked at the 50s, 60s, and even into the early 70s, for instance, shows like Ozzie and Harriet, Happy Days. Mm-hmm. It was a man dutifully going out to work. He came home, took care of his family. The wife took care of the home. And even in Happy Days, it was pretty much the same synopsis. But what you also seen, too, were the children who had a lot of respect for their parents. At least that was the paradigm. It started moving into the 80s, and you began to notice the respect was there, but now there was a slight injection of sarcasm, as though now children should be allowed at will, at any given unnotice, to be able to express their points of view, sort of like pushing parameters. You move into the 90s, the sarcasm really becomes more prevalent now, as though the parents are beginning to regress. They're actually becoming children, and the children are becoming adults. And we've actually covered this on certain different segments of our Beyond 50 radio program. And now in the new millennium, it's almost as though the children have now completely become adults. The parents have thrown their hands in the air, so to speak, and completely accepted that they're going to be disrespected regardless of the fact that they are parents and that they have raised these children. And the weirdest thing about this is it has, in its own way, and this is just my term, infected society with extreme disrespect, in which I actually seen that happening with a neighbor, where they were in a situation they had to raise their own grandson because the mother was pretty much non-existent.
Right.
And I would see that here was this kid would be out in front of his friends. He got to a level that even in junior high school he was on house arrest of all things. So that shows just how heavily he was influenced by what we were talking about, the pop culture and whatnot. But I literally would watch him stand there and disrespect his grandmother's wishes and just tearing her up, and I'm thinking, oh my goodness, what has our society come to when you see that blatant sort of a thing happening? You would have never seen that 20, 30, or 40 years ago, but now it's just everywhere.
Yeah, I think a couple of things and I'm not sure what you found on your earlier shows, but what comes up for me when I hear that is two things. For one thing, the family is completely fragmented, and just about everybody I know has divorced parents.
Right.
And we're navigating a new paradigm here, and it's a really tough one. And part of that, and the other part of a big part of that is that there's no cultural expectation or model anymore for kids that is life affirming to them.
Right.
So they are not. There's this great. There's a study done where kids were placed in a field, basically like an open field, and asked to play, and you found that they huddled all together, and were sort of this little bundled cluster, kind of weary about their surroundings. But when they found that the more walls they put up around like what would become a schoolyard, the more they opened up and began to play and run around and have freedom. And the analogy is that having boundaries, having limitations actually provides a certain amount of freedom and safety. But what's happened is that kids today don't have a feeling of safety. They are prey right now, and they are defensive, and they're not. I don't know how conscious they are of it. Some of them are fairly conscious of it, but if you look at the level to which our children are preyed upon by the economy,
right, exactly,
seen as a source of cash, a group to market to, and it's insidious, the levels to which they're being set upon by institutions that they think are their friends, like MySpace, Facebook, things like that.
An interesting point is we had a futurist who was talking about banking and how they're literally eating their young, so to speak, and he was right. Just like you said, you have the MySpace, before you know it, credit is extended to kids who don't even have jobs, and the next thing you know, by the time they're in their mid-20s, they're broke and they're working in careers or jobs they hate, but they feel that now they have no other choice.
Yeah, and if you go, and kind of going back to the original theme, if you go back to the traditional societies, like I was just in Guatemala just over a year ago, and and it may have been one of the villages near where this guy that you're talking about was, because it was right around Lake Atitlan, which is one of the major bodies of water in Guatemala. And the life of that village, I mean, granted, it's under a lot of transition right now, and a lot of what their cultural heritage has been stripped away or is in the process of fragmenting, but they still, what you see is that guys know what they are about there. They are still, there is still a conversation alive in the ritual of especially around like the Holy Week ceremonies, where there are reminders of stuff that was going on just a couple hundred years ago before Pizarro, or no, Don Pedro Alvarado, excuse me, kind of upset the apple cart. But the guys, the young men, still engage in ritual together as a group, and they go through. They carry these giant floats of religious imagery on their backs, and there's like 40 guys, and they have to carry this thing on their backs, straining, walking at a snail's pace for like 10 hours or something like that. This ridiculous superhuman feat that they all engage together. And if you look at the women there, they all dress the same, which is pretty interesting. They wear these beautiful woven embroidered outfits. But what I was stricken by is even the young girls, who are maybe, less than 10 years old, walk with a poise and a posture that you would never see in this country.
Right.
They know, you may find fault with with the agreements around what is a woman, in Guatemalan life, and especially if you're coming, from a feminist, postmodern, standpoint or whatever. But there is a certain safety and emotional safety, I think, that comes with that, where they just don't have the angst and the questions that are besetting, Western kids today who have no roadmap other than what they see on television or YouTube or whatever.
Mm-hmm. And part of that roadmap, too, that as we were talking about earlier, is the fact that, for instance, a first rite of passage is you go to high school and you begin to go out on dates. You get to get away from the family. You eventually have a curfew if anybody ever respects that anymore. There's a boundary that in many cases has been broken. The opportunity to turn 16 and to begin driving a car. Then the next initiation, it usually happens earlier than this, but generally happens for kids who go off into college, and then there's the rite of passage. How much alcohol can you consume in your freshman year?
Right.
And will you graduate college, without being bankrupt at the same time? So you can see how these kind of things, even from a spiritual sense, lead to nowhere. When you were alluding to the Guatemalan people down there, as I was talking about that book earlier, Long Life, Honey in the Heart, as they were talking about, or he was talking about Catholics who were coming to basically assimilate and take over these lands and trying to get these people to cross over to their particular faith, and were sharing spiritual symbols of their particular religion, if you will. And they would take a look at these symbols, these carvings, whatever it was they were being handed to respect and perhaps idolize. He simply said you could hold these symbols, take a look at these things in your hand, and what you realize just by the artisanship of these artifacts, that this comes from a culture that has been spiritually bankrupt for quite a long time. So you can see how those two kind of play together very carefully.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now,
Hello?
What would you encourage perhaps people to do who are listening to this program today who maybe want to get back on track? Because as you can see, there is a sense of self-identity that is being lost, as well as the idea of feeling that you belong.
Yeah, there's a couple things. A huge part of it has to do with community and finding your people. Now, that's not always an easy thing to do, but, depending on what your interests are, whether you have spiritual beliefs, whether you have hobbies or whatever, somewhere out there are people like you. Part of your job is to find them so that you are connected to other people. A friend of mine has a brilliant saying. She says, don't go alone into your mind. It's a dangerous place. It's dark and you have no friends there. And so it's really important to be connected to other people. And as we've kind of been alluding, a big part of one's standing in the world is how they are viewed and held by their community. I mean, you won't know what your gifts are, what you have to contribute as a unique man or woman, until you have a mirror for that, until you have someone acknowledging you, saying, thank you for this. We can, or we can count on you to, if nothing else, bring the donuts every Sunday to church.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, every little bit counts. It's like, okay, there's a place where I fit in. That is huge. And then the other part of it is to also, begin to examine, your values and what's important to you. Do you have something you want to contribute to the world, to humanity? Is there something you stand for? And what is it? Are you living in a way that serves that? Because that's, one of the differences, the classical differences between childhood and adulthood is that, a child is focused on him or herself. And that's, there's an egoism that comes with being a child. And adulthood is about putting that ego aside and being about something bigger than yourself or different from yourself, and define what that is. If you look at so many adults today who are in a in a spiritually bankrupt place or a depressed or sad place or something like that, or an unfulfilled place, you'll find that there's nothing out there that is, well, there may be something out there calling to them, but they're not listening.
Mm-hmm.
They're not going after it. They're not identifying with something outside of their, smaller world. And if you take if you look at the collective effect of that in this world, you have I don't know what 6 point whatever billion people. And, maybe there's in the order, and that's a huge number, there's in the order of maybe several million, but probably nowhere near a billion of that number, who are seriously committed to making the world a better place in some way, shape, or form. Everyone else is just pretty much like getting by, tending to their own business, and
just not really engaged in the world.
Yeah, asleep at the wheel. Granted, everyone has a lot of concerns, and everyone, has families to feed and everything like that. But these times are strenuous for the human race. And the more people who are actually trying to do something, the better. And being an adult is about trying to do something, being up to something.
Well, it's certainly kind of, yeah. It's just like you said, the times, they certainly are interesting, and you can see how we actually have created, in many ways, a fragmented culture, which has seemingly no boundaries. And you try to put up the boundaries, and some expert comes along and says, well, what are you doing that for? I think sometimes you just kind of have to throw your hands up in the air and say, okay, why don't I walk away from this and, as you suggested, go and find a community where I feel that I belong, where I feel that I can contribute, because that's also one of the opportunities that we haven't talked about yet, is the fact that one day you will become an elder. Now, will you become one of those elders that are disdained, as we were talking about earlier, with the sarcasm of the youth because of the feeling of their own abandonment, if you will, through culture? Or will you be one of those who will be respected and people will want to know about your experience and your wisdom so that they can guide themselves? Which one do you want to be at the opposite end of the tunnel? So you can see where, as you listen to this program today, at least sit in it, bask in it, think about it, and decide what your next step is, because you do have an opportunity to live that. And I see elders, honestly, that don't even deserve respect because they're just not giving it to the world themselves. And you think, where have you lost yourself? That you think just because you're older, you deserve that respect when you're not even paying that to someone else. And so you can see where you really need to get grounded into yourself and realize, I am someone of value and I am someone who has something to offer, and you take the very next step that's important.
Yeah, and I would say to avoid that, I would posit that those bitter or angry or entitled kind of elders are ones that never did the work to integrate their polarity.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the man never developed his feminine. He never became a nurturer. You know, then he wonders why his life doesn't work. You know, the woman, she never got fierce, so she became a victim and became, you know, the shrew.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so it's so important, as you mentioned, to do your work. You know, to ground and you know, and be happy.
Exactly.
You know,
What's
it's
the point
not
of
like
being alive and being miserable? That's for sure.
yeah, no one likes a miserable old man. You know, but you know, you go to what's interesting. One of the things that Allison mentions, she says, if you want to spot an elder, go to Home Depot and look for that guy with the white hair in the plumbing department. You know, he's going to be the guy who just like spends a half hour with you, just telling you just the right, you know, thing that you need. You know, he's kind of done with his, you know, with the active part of any striving in his life, and he's just got his job and he's kind of doing his thing and living on his pension and whatever. But he's there and he's making a difference and he's happy to help out.
Exactly.
You know, that there's not a whole lot of ego left.
Mm-hmm. Not that it's even necessary by that either.
Yeah.
I'll tell you, it's always a wonderful opportunity to have conversations with people like you, especially about this, what we're talking about today. You know, rites of passage, initiations, the idea that you grow in stages that are very well defined and you hold them and you know them. And I just feel that a lot of times it's a conversation that has really sorely been missing because, as we were talking about earlier with pop culture, for instance, and media and entertainment, the whole idea is to see how quickly we can get you independently on your own, doing your own thing, getting things for yourself. And the message on the other side, which seems vague and maybe on the outer limits, is what you need to do is contribute to society to make a difference. And so you can really see the mixed balance or imbalance, if you will, where there's a lot of source of confusion. And again, there just needs to be more conversations and more of that message getting out there because, you know, our youth basically is our investment to how we become as we grow and we age ourselves. And it's been a pleasure to have you on our Beyond 50 radio program today. Any particular talks or any kind of work coming up? Because from what you're doing, I can see you're one of those that agrees with me. Let's get this out there. Let's start getting these conversation things going on a regular basis.
Well, thank you for giving me a chance to say so. If you go to my website, which is lifeluster.com, and you go to the events page, that's where ongoingly you'll be able to see kind of what I'm up to. I am actually in the process of planning some really neat things that I can't quite talk about yet because I don't have it completely fleshed out.
Right.
But there will be some really great community gatherings in Portland. I also am co-hosting here on TalkShoe Radio later today and every Wednesday for a while a show called Healers Lounge, which is a support program for people in the healing arts. And so you can find out about that on the website. But I'm constantly looking for ways to bring community, bring healing, bring awareness to the people in my life, and so stay tuned is my message. Thank you.
Well, Al Polito, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today, and hopefully between the two of us, along with the influence of many others that we hopefully do attract, that we can help, again, put our contribution of passage, of initiation, again, to where hopefully we can stem the tide that has certainly run rapid. Not that there's anything wrong with that. We kind of put ourselves in this position, but how we can change that and have more loving communities, more nurturing communities where people all say, what can I do to contribute and be part of this? And that certainly is an encouraging move, especially since we're all trying to move toward peaceful solutions to coexisting together. So we want to thank you for being on the program today.
Thank you so much, Daniel.
You bet. Again, and for those of you out there listening, our guest today, Al Polito, and visit his website, lifeluster.com, and it's spelt just the way you heard it. I want to thank everybody for joining us here. You've been listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis, and be sure to visit our website, beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50 with a 50. Find out what we're up to there, and also sign up for our free weekly e-newsletter. Visit our blog. And if you have any questions or comments about the Beyond 50 radio program, we certainly welcome those. Again, thank you for joining us today, and remember, live your day past halfway.